My name is Lily Thorne, and I'm 42 years old now, a specialist in a field so niche most people don't even know it exists. But 20 years ago, I was just the disappointing daughter in a family that worshipped heroes. I never expected that my quiet, dusty world of pigments and paper would be the only thing that could save my family from absolute ruin, or that my greatest weakness would become the weapon that won our most important battle. It's a strange thing, when the life you were taught to be ashamed of becomes the one thing that matters. What would you do if the very skills your family scorned were the only things that could save them? Before I dive into this story of treason, betrayal, and the hidden power of forgotten things, I'd love to know where you're all watching from today. Let me know in the comments below. And if you've ever felt underestimated or had a passion dismissed as a waste of time, go ahead and hit that like button, because I think this story will resonate with you. And for all the new viewers here, please consider subscribing to join a community of people who know that strength comes in many, many forms. The Thorne family home was less a house and more a museum, dedicated to a single exhibit, my older brother Sebastian. Every wall, every shelf, every available surface was a testament to his glory. There were photographs of him in his crisp military academy uniform, his jaw set with a seriousness that seemed beyond his years. There were framed medals, gleaming under the recessed lighting my father had installed himself, each one representing some act of bravery in a far-flung, dusty corner of the world I could barely imagine. His ceremonial sword from graduation was mounted over the fireplace, its polished steel a constant, cold reflection of the room's reverence. My father, General Marcus Thorne, would often stand before it, a glass of whiskey in hand, his gaze distant as if he were seeing not just the sword, but the entire lineage of warriors he believed our family represented. Sebastian was the perfect continuation of that line. He was strong, decisive, and uncomplicated in his patriotism. He was everything my father understood and valued. And then there was me. My contributions to the family decor were relegated to the darkest corners of the house. A single small painting I did in high school hung in the hallway leading to the laundry room, a place people only passed through. It was a detailed watercolor of a kingfisher, its feathers rendered with a precision that had taken me weeks to perfect. I remembered the day I gave it to my father. I was 16, and my heart was hammering with a desperate need for his approval. I had wrapped it in brown paper and tied it with a string, presenting it to him in his study. He was cleaning his service pistol, the scent of gun oil thick in the air. He glanced at the painting, a brief, dismissive flick of his eyes. "That's nice, Lily," he'd said, his voice flat, before turning his full attention to Sebastian, who had just walked in holding a cheap plastic trophy from a track meet. "Son, first place in the 400 meters. Now that's what I'm talking about. That's the Thorne spirit." He had clapped Sebastian on the back, his voice booming with a pride that had never once been directed at me. Sebastian, to his credit, had looked momentarily uncomfortable, but he was a boy, and the son of our father's approval was too warm to refuse. He just smiled and let himself be celebrated. I had quietly taken my painting and retreated, the sting of that casual dismissal feeling like a physical blow. That dynamic never changed. It only calcified as we grew older. When Sebastian was accepted into the National Military Academy, my parents threw a lavish party that felt like a coronation. The garden was filled with my father's influential friends, men with stern faces and chests full of ribbons. Champagne flowed, and toasts were made to the next generation of Thorne leadership. 2 years later, when I received my acceptance letter to one of the most prestigious art conservation programs in the country, the reaction was muted. My mother, Lydia, a woman whose entire existence seemed dedicated to managing my father's moods and upholding the family's pristine image, sighed. "Well, it's a lovely hobby, dear," she said, arranging flowers in a vase with surgical precision. "I suppose it's important to have a hobby." My father was more direct. We were in his study, the room where all serious pronouncements were made. He didn't even look up from the documents he was reviewing. "Art school? What kind of a life is that? You'll be painting pictures in a dusty attic while your brother is out there serving his country, making a real difference." A real difference. Those words became the refrain of my life. Sebastian made a difference. I made pretty things. It didn't matter that my program was incredibly competitive, that it was a complex blend of chemistry, history, and fine art. To them, it was finger painting. I was the sensitive one, the dreamer, the one who dealt in useless beauty, while my brother dealt in the hard realities of the world. He was the shield of the nation. I was the delicate ornament on a forgotten shelf. They paid my tuition, of course. The Thorne family image demanded that their children be provided for, but it was an investment made with an air of weary obligation, as if they were funding an expensive and ultimately pointless charity case. My sanctuary, my rebellion, was my studio. It was a small, rented space above a quiet bookstore downtown, miles away from the sterile, metal-draped walls of my family home. It smelled of linseed oil, turpentine, and old paper. Sunlight, thick with dust motes, streamed through a large north-facing window. This was where I could breathe. This was where my useless knowledge was everything. I didn't just paint. I was a scholar of the physical world. I learned how pigments were made, how iron gall ink oxidized and ate into parchment over centuries, how the rag content of 17th century paper differed from that of the 18th. I could look at a painting and see not just the image but the artist's process, the history of the materials, the secrets hidden beneath the surface. I learned to spot forgeries by the anachronistic presence of titanium white, or the telltale ultraviolet fluorescence of a modern varnish. My mind became a library of material facts, of textures, colors, and chemical compositions. My mentor, a retired university professor named Samuel Finch, was the first person who saw my passion not as a quaint hobby, but as a formidable intellect. He was a small man with a shock of white hair and glasses that were perpetually perched on the end of his nose. He would visit my studio, peering at my work tables which were littered with glass vials of powdered pigments, scraps of vellum, and magnifying lamps. "Lily," he told me once, his voice a dry rustle like old pages turning, "most people look at art and see a picture. You see a story written in molecules. Your understanding of materials isn't just a skill, it's a science. It's a language that doesn't lie. Remember that. Paper and paint always tell the truth, even when people don't." His validation was a lifeline, a quiet counter-narrative to the one I heard at home. The contrast was never starker than during Sebastian's visits home. He was a major now, a decorated war hero with stories that held my parents captive for hours. One evening, about a year before everything fell apart, we were all gathered for a formal dinner. Sebastian, lean and confident in his dress uniform, was recounting a tense operation on a disputed border. My father was leaning forward, his eyes gleaming, hanging on every word. My mother watched him, her expression a mixture of terror and adoration. I tried to join the conversation, to bridge the immense chasm between our worlds. "That sounds incredibly stressful, Sebastian," I said. "I actually just finished a project that required some intense focus, too. It was a 16th century manuscript that had suffered water damage. The ink was bleeding into the vellum, and I had to develop a new solvent compound to stabilize it without—" My father cut me off, not with malice, but with an oblivious impatience that was somehow worse. "Yes, dear, that's fascinating. Solvents. Sebastian, tell us, what was the enemy's disposition after your maneuver? Did command give you the commendation you deserved?" The conversation swerved back to him, leaving me in its wake. I saw Sebastian glance at me for a second, a flicker of something pity, perhaps, or discomfort in his eyes, before he turned back to our father. He was not unkind, my brother. He was simply a product of his environment, conditioned to believe that his world of strategy and conflict was the only one that truly mattered. He loved me in the abstract, the way one loves a distant cousin. He didn't understand me, and he had never been encouraged to try. During that same dinner, he briefly mentioned a rival, a Major Gideon Cale. "Cale's still stewing about that command post," Sebastian said with a slight shake of his head. "He thinks his seniority entitled him to it. The man holds a grudge like it's a field pack." My father snorted. "Politics. Cale never had the instincts for true command. The review board saw that. They made the right choice. It was a fleeting comment, a piece of military gossip that I barely registered at the time. It was just another detail from a world I wasn't part of, a world where men like my brother and father made decisions of consequence while I stayed in my quiet room playing with colors." The call came on a Tuesday morning. I was in my studio, meticulously cleaning a grime-covered oil painting from the 1940s, when my phone buzzed with my mother's name. I almost let it go to voicemail. Her calls were usually just a prelude to some family obligation I was expected to attend with a grateful smile. But something made me answer. Her voice was a raw, ragged thing I had never heard before. It was completely stripped of its usual composure. "Lily," she sobbed, "you have to come home, right now. They've taken him." "Taken who?" "Mom, what are you talking about?" "Sebastian," she wailed. "The military police. They came to the house. They arrested him. Lily, they say it's treason." The word hung in the air, so monstrous and alien it felt like it belonged to a different language. Treason. In the Thorne family, that word was the ultimate sacrilege. It was a concept so antithetical to our entire identity that it couldn't possibly be real. I rushed home, my mind a frantic, buzzing hive of confusion and dread. The house, normally a shrine of quiet order, was in chaos. My mother was pacing the living room, her face pale and blotchy. My father was on the phone in his study, his voice a low, furious growl that I could hear through the closed door. He was a general, a man who commanded thousands, yet in that moment he sounded utterly helpless. When he finally emerged, his face was a mask of thunderous disbelief. "There's been a mistake," he said, his voice dangerously low, "a catastrophic political mistake. Someone is trying to ruin me by ruining my son." The details came out in fragments, pieced together from my father's enraged phone calls and my mother's terrified whispers. Sebastian was being held at a nearby military base, formally charged with espionage. The accusation was that he had sold strategic plans of our nation's border defenses to a hostile neighboring state. It was unthinkable. Sebastian, who had bled for his country on more than one occasion, selling its secrets? The idea was ludicrous. But the military was taking it with deadly seriousness. They had, they claimed, irrefutable proof. A few days later, my father's lawyer, a grim-faced man in a pinstripe suit, came to the house to brief us. He spread copies of the evidence on our polished dining room table. There were bank records showing large, anonymous deposits into an offshore account in Sebastian's name. There were encrypted emails, allegedly traced to his personal computer. And then there was the centerpiece, the smoking gun, a hand-drawn map. It was a tactical overlay of the northern ridge, a highly sensitive border region. It detailed troop positions, surveillance blind spots, and patrol routes. The map was supposedly drawn on older government-issue paper stock, and the handwriting, the lawyer confirmed, was a near-perfect match for Sebastian's. It had been discovered, he explained, during a routine search of Sebastian's personal belongings at his on-base quarters, triggered by an anonymous tip. "The prosecution's case is strong," the lawyer said, his voice devoid of comfort. "They believe he copied the plans onto this map and was preparing to pass it to a foreign contact." My father stared at the photograph of the map, his jaw working silently. My mother let out a small, wounded sound like a dying animal. They were both drowning in the horror of the accusation, in the public shame that was about to crash down on the Thorne name. I, however, found myself looking not at the information on the map, but at the object itself. I leaned closer to the high-resolution photograph. Something was wrong. It was a subtle, instinctual feeling, the same kind of feeling I got when I examined a clever forgery. The lines were precise, the information damning, but the map itself, it felt dissonant. The aging on the paper seemed too uniform, a flat monochromatic yellow that didn't quite look like the natural oxidation of cellulose fibers. The ink, a deep sepia, had a certain sheen to it that bothered me. It sat on top of the paper's fibers, rather than sinking into them. "Dad," I said quietly, pointing to the photograph, "that map, are they sure it's authentic?" My father turned on me, his grief and rage needing a target. "Authentic? Of course it's not authentic. Your brother is not a traitor, but the map itself is real. It exists, it's in an evidence locker, and it's going to send him to prison for life." "No, that's not what I mean," I persisted, my voice small but firm. "I mean the object, the paper, the ink. It doesn't look right. It looks performed, like it's trying too hard to look old." My mother looked at me as if I had lost my mind. "Lily, for heaven's sake, what are you talking about? What does any of that matter? This is about national security, not one of your dusty old paintings." Stay out of this, Lily, my father commanded, his voice shaking with the effort of control. This is a matter for soldiers and lawyers. What could you possibly do? Go away and paint something. Just stay out of our way. The dismissal was as familiar as my own name. In the biggest crisis our family had ever faced, I was once again relegated to the sidelines, the useless child with her useless hobbies. But this time, it felt different. For the first time, I suspected that my useless world and their real world had collided, and I might be the only person standing at the intersection. While my father marshaled his network of powerful men, and my mother descended into a state of sedated despair, I retreated to my studio. But I wasn't running away. I was running toward the only battlefield I knew how to command. The first few weeks were a blur of frustration. The official investigation was a closed loop, an ironclad military system that had no place for a civilian artist. My father's lawyers were focused on discrediting the anonymous tip and the financial evidence, treating the map as an unfortunate but solid piece of the prosecution's case. They saw its contents, not its composition. When I tried to explain my suspicions to them, they gave me the same patronizing smiles my parents did. Miss Thorne, we appreciate your concern for your brother, but our forensic teams have authenticated the handwriting. Let us handle the legal strategy. They heard artist and thought emotional, unreliable. They couldn't see the chemist, the historian, the material scientist that lived alongside the artist. Blocked from official channels, I knew I had to conduct my own investigation. I started with the photograph of the map. I spent hours with it under my magnifying lamp, my face inches from the glossy print, until I could see the very texture of the paper fibers, the subtle bleed of the ink. It gnawed at me, that ink. It was too perfect, too consistent for the type of iron gall ink that would have been standard issue for cartographers on that kind of paper stock. Real iron gall ink is corrosive. It burns itself into the page over time, creating a microscopic halo, a slight blurring at the edges as the acid eats away at the cellulose. This ink was crisp. It was a performance. I called Samuel Finch. His calm, dry voice was an anchor in my panic. "Samuel, I need your help," I said, trying to keep my own voice from trembling. "I need everything you know about mid-20th century military-grade cartographic paper and ink, specifically domestic production from the 1960s. There was a pause, and then he said, "This sounds more specific than an academic query, Lily. Are you all right?" I told him everything. I expected him to be skeptical, to tell me I was out of my depth. Instead, he just listened patiently. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Paper and paint always tell the truth," he said softly, repeating his old mantra. "All right, I have some contacts at the National Archives and a few specialist suppliers. Let me make some calls. You, in the meantime, need to focus. What is the paper telling you? What is the ink saying? Listen to them. They'll give you the questions you need to ask." His belief in me was a gust of wind in my sails. I used my savings, a modest fund I had been building for a down payment on a house, and started sourcing materials. I bought samples of old government stationery from specialty dealers online. I acquired different formulations of modern and historical inks. My studio began to look less like an artist's workshop and more like a forensic lab. I filled notebooks with observations, comparing the feathering patterns of different inks on different papers, documenting the way cellulose fibers yellowed under UV light versus how they looked after being artificially aged. One evening, my father stormed into my studio, unannounced. He had never been there before, and he looked around at the chaotic tables, the chemical smells, and the strange equipment with utter contempt.
"What is all this?"
He demanded, his voice echoing in the high-ceilinged room. "I just got a call from General Hawthorne's aide. He said my daughter has been making inquiries about historical procurement records for ink. Do you have any idea how that makes me look? You are embarrassing this family, Lily, playing detective with your little art supplies while your brother's life is on the line. I'm trying to help him." I shot back, my voice rising with a passion that surprised us both. "The map is a fake, Dad. I know it is. I just have to prove how." "A fake?" He laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "The handwriting is Sebastian's. The information is accurate. It's a map. It's not a Rembrandt. You are out of your depth. This is a world of facts and evidence, not feelings and color palettes. Stop this foolishness. You're making things worse." He threatened to cut off the allowance he still provided me, the last vestige of his parental control. He saw my work not as a desperate attempt to save my brother, but as a selfish, childish game. His words were a physical blow, sending me reeling back into the familiar role of the disappointing daughter. For a moment, my resolve wavered. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was just a fool playing with paper dolls in the face of a firing squad. The next day, I was permitted a short visit with Sebastian. He was in a sterile gray room, wearing a standard-issue jumpsuit that seemed to swallow him. The confident swagger of the war hero was gone, replaced by a deep, weary despair. He looked thin, exhausted. "They've built a perfect case, Lily," he said, his voice a hollow monotone. "The money, the emails, that map. I don't know how they did it, but it's perfect." I leaned forward, my hands flat on the table separating us. "Sebastian, the map is a forgery. I'm sure of it. I'm working on proving it." He gave me a sad, tired smile. The same kind of smile he gave me when I tried to explain the complexities of oil glazes. "Lily, I appreciate it. I really do. But it's hopeless. Just look after Mom and Dad. Be there for them." He was protecting me, even now. He was the strong older brother, and I was the fragile little sister who needed to be shielded from the harsh realities of the world. He didn't believe me. He didn't believe in me. That was the moment everything crystallized. My father's scorn, the lawyer's condescension, and now my own brother's gentle dismissal. They were all walls I had to break through. Their disbelief became my fuel. I went back to my studio that night with a renewed, almost ferocious focus. I wasn't just fighting for Sebastian anymore. I was fighting for myself, for every time my passion had been trivialized, for every time my world had been deemed lesser. My first real breakthrough came from the paper. After weeks of searching, Samuel had managed to procure a few authenticated sheets of the exact paper stock used for the map, sourced from a decommissioned military archive. Under a digital microscope, the difference was astounding. The fibers of the authentic, decades-old paper showed clear signs of natural lignification, a specific type of yellowing and brittleness that occurs unevenly over a long period. The paper from the forged map, however, had a uniform color. It was too consistent. I remembered reading about forgers' techniques in one of my conservation textbooks. I took one of my modern paper samples, brewed a strong pot of black tea, and brushed the liquid carefully over the sheet. Then I baked it in a small toaster oven at a low temperature for an hour. The result, when I pulled it out, was uncanny. It had the same flat, even yellow-brown patina as the paper in the evidence photo. The forger hadn't used old paper. They had used new paper and aged it artificially. It was a good trick, but to a trained eye, it was as clumsy as a child's scrawl. That was my first piece of concrete proof. Next came the ink. I spent days researching the specific chemical formula for the K177 iron gall ink, the standard for military cartography during that period. It was a highly acidic, corrosive ink. I managed to replicate a small batch. When I applied it to the authentic paper, the effect was immediate. It didn't just dry on the surface, it sank in, its acidic content causing a minuscule but measurable burn-in effect on the paper fibers. I compared magnified photos of my test with the photo of the forged map. The ink on the forgery just sat there, inert and lifeless. It was a modern, pH-neutral archival ink, designed to look old but lacking the essential, self-destructive character of the real thing. The forger had chosen stability over authenticity, a fatal error. But the final, irrefutable piece of evidence, the one that would blow the entire case apart, came from a tiny splash of color. The map used colored pencils or inks to denote certain zones: red for danger zones, blue for waterways, and a specific shade of yellow-brown for undeveloped terrain. It was this color, a dull, earthy ochre, that snagged my attention. There was something familiar about its particular granulation and hue. I had seen it before. I went through my pigment library, a vast collection of dozens of vials of powdered color, my own personal encyclopedia of light and earth. My heart began to pound as I cross-referenced the color with supplier catalogs from the past decade. And then I found it. The pigment was called Cyanase Earth Variant 3. It was a synthetic iron oxide, developed by a small chemical company in Berlin. It was lauded for its light fastness and its perfect imitation of historical ochre pigments, making it a favorite among modern restoration artists and sophisticated forgers. I looked at the date on the company's technical data sheet. The pigment had been invented 4 years and 7 months ago. It hadn't existed anywhere on Earth before then. I sat back in my chair, the vial of ochre powder in my hand. My studio was silent, except for the frantic beating of my own heart. The forger had been meticulous. They had gotten the handwriting right, the information right, the paper aging almost right. But they had slipped. They had reached for a color from their modern toolkit, a tiny, seemingly insignificant detail, and in that one speck of anachronistic dust, they had signed their confession. Now, all I had to do was find a way to make someone listen. Getting into the court-martial was the easy part. Getting anyone to take me seriously was the real battle. The day of the hearing arrived cloaked in a gray, oppressive drizzle that matched the mood of my family perfectly. Sebastian's trial was being held in a formal tribunal chamber on the military base. It was a severe wood-paneled room, dominated by a high bench where 3 senior officers would sit as judges. The air was thick with the scent of floor polish and institutional dread. My parents and I sat in the front row reserved for family. My father was a stone statue in his perfectly pressed suit, his face an unreadable mask of fury. My mother clutched a handkerchief in her trembling hands, her eyes red-rimmed and vacant. They had both forbidden me from bringing my evidence, telling me my presence alone was what was required. But tucked away in my large leather portfolio were my carefully mounted comparison photographs, my lab reports on the ink, and a small sealed vial containing the Cyanese Earth Variant 3 pigment. The prosecution began its case with methodical, brutal efficiency. They presented the bank records, the emails, and finally the map. The lead prosecutor, a sharp-featured colonel with cold, intelligent eyes, had the physical map brought out and displayed on an easel. It sat there under the courtroom lights, looking ancient and damning. "This map," the colonel declared, his voice ringing with conviction, "drawn in Major Thorne's own hand, represents a betrayal of the highest order. It is a blueprint for our nation's defeat on its most vulnerable front." He then called a handwriting expert who testified that the writing was, with over 99% certainty, a match to Sebastian's. The net was tightening, and I could feel the hope draining from the room. Sebastian sat beside his lawyer, his shoulders slumped, the fight seemingly gone out of him. During a brief recess, I knew it was my only chance. I had done my research on the presiding judge, General Thorne. He was known as a rigid, by-the-book officer, but also a man of deep intellectual curiosity and unimpeachable integrity. He was old school, a man who believed in truth above all else. Ignoring my father's hissed command to sit down and be quiet, I approached the bailiff. "I need to speak with General Thorne," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "It is a matter of critical evidence." The bailiff scoffed, but I persisted, invoking my father's name and the gravity of the situation. It was enough to get me a reluctant escort to the judge's chambers. General Thorne was sitting at his desk, his uniform jacket off, reading through a thick binder. He looked up at me over his spectacles, his expression impatient. "Miss Thorne, you have 5 minutes. This is highly irregular." My heart was hammering against my ribs, but I took a deep breath and opened my portfolio on his desk. I didn't make emotional appeals. I didn't talk about my brother's character. I spoke to the scholar I hoped was hiding beneath the uniform. "General," I began, my voice clear and precise, "the prosecution's case rests on the authenticity of that map. I am an expert in art conservation and historical materials, and I am telling you, as an expert, that the map is a forgery, a modern, sophisticated forgery." He raised an eyebrow, skeptical but not dismissive. I quickly laid out my findings. I started with the paper. "This is a microscopic photograph of the paper fibers from the evidence map," I said, pointing to the first image. "Note the uniform color. This is artificial aging, most likely from a chemical wash or baking. This," I said, sliding another photo next to it, "is authentic paper from the same period. The lignification is random, chaotic, the result of decades, not hours in an oven." His eyes narrowed, and he leaned in closer. I moved on to the ink. This is the forged ink. It sits on the surface. This is authentic iron gall ink. See how it bites into the paper, how it corrodes the fibers? The forger used a stable, modern archival ink to avoid the document degrading, a classic forger's mistake. He was silent, his gaze fixed on the photographs. He was listening. The impatience was gone, replaced by a focused intensity. Finally, I played my trump card. I placed the small, sealed vial of yellow-brown powder on his desk. General, the map is marked with colored zones. One of them uses this pigment. It's a synthetic iron oxide called Chinese Earth Variant 3. My specialty is identifying pigments. I know this one intimately. I paused, letting the weight of my next words land. It was invented in Germany 4 years ago. It could not exist on a document purportedly made from decades-old materials. General Hawthorne stared at the vial, then at me. A long, silent moment stretched between us. He picked up his phone and spoke a few quiet words into it. Get the head of the forensics lab down to the tribunal chamber, now. He looked at me, his expression grim. Miss Thorne, you will present these findings to the court. I am overriding the prosecution's objections. When we returned to the courtroom, my father looked at me with pure fury, thinking I had done something to further humiliate them. The prosecutor objected vehemently. Sir, this is a farce. She is a civilian, an art student. She has no standing. Colonel, General Hawthorne's voice cut through the room like a sheet of ice. This court is interested in the truth, regardless of its source. Your objection is overruled. Miss Thorne, you will be sworn in as an expert witness. A shocked murmur rippled through the gallery. I walked to the witness stand, my legs feeling like they were made of water. I stood before the court, before my stunned family and my despairing brother, and I began to speak. I walked them through my evidence, step by step, just as I had for the general. I kept my voice calm and academic, letting the facts speak for themselves. I presented the magnified photographs on the courtroom's large monitors. I explained the chemistry of ink oxidation and the telltale signs of artificial aging. The entire room was silent, captivated. For the first time in my life, my family was listening to me talk about my work, and they were listening as if their lives depended on it. Then, for the finale, I held up the small vial of pigment. This yellow ochre, I said, my voice ringing with a confidence I had never known, is Cyanase Earth Variant 3. It was invented 4 years and 7 months ago. I can provide the court with the patent number and the chemical composition. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. I saw Sebastian's head snap up, his eyes wide with disbelief and a dawning, brilliant hope. I had one last piece. Samuel's contacts had come through at the last minute. This specific pigment is sold by only one specialty distributor in this entire country, I continued, my eyes scanning the gallery. Their sales records show a single, large purchase of this pigment, along with several formulations of archival ink and pre-war paper stock made 2 months ago. The purchase was made by Major Gideon Cale. All eyes swiveled to the back of the room where Major Cale was sitting. His face, which had been growing progressively paler throughout my testimony, was now ashen. The color drained from it completely. A mask of smug certainty had crumbled into raw panic. He jumped to his feet and made a clumsy, desperate bolt for the exit. He didn't even make it 3 steps before 2 massive military policemen tackled him to the ground. The courtroom erupted into chaos. But through the noise, I saw only one thing: my brother Sebastian. His face buried in his hands, his shoulders shaking with the convulsive sobs of a man who had just been pulled back from the edge of an abyss. My useless knowledge had set him free. The aftermath was a strange, surreal whirlwind. The courtroom was cleared, Major Cale was dragged away in handcuffs, and Sebastian was immediately, unceremoniously exonerated. The moment the proceedings were officially dismissed, he crossed the room in 3 long strides and pulled me into an embrace so tight it lifted me off my feet. I could feel his tears soaking the shoulder of my blouse. "You saved me," he whispered, his voice thick and choked with emotion. "Lily, I'm so sorry. I never understood." Behind him, my parents stood frozen, their faces a complex tapestry of shock, relief, and a bewildering confusion. They looked at me as if they were seeing me for the first time. The quiet, artistic daughter had just detonated a bomb of truth in the center of their world, and they had no idea how to process the shrapnel. The car ride home was shrouded in a heavy, suffocating silence. My father drove, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. My mother sat in the passenger seat, weeping quietly into her handkerchief, though her tears now seemed to be of relief rather than despair. I sat in the back, the city lights sliding past the window, feeling strangely calm, strangely empty. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving behind a profound exhaustion. We were halfway home when my father did something he had never done before. He pulled the car over to the side of the road, the engine idling softly. He turned in his seat, his stern military bearing completely gone, replaced by something vulnerable and raw. He looked at me, really looked at me, his eyes searching my face. He couldn't quite form an apology. The words were too foreign to him. Instead, he asked a question. How? His voice was hoarse. How did you know all that? About the paper, the ink. It was the first time in my 30 years that he had ever asked about my work with genuine, unadulterated curiosity. I didn't gloat. I didn't say, "I told you so." The victory was too profound for such petty triumphs. I simply answered him. I explained the science of lignification, the chemical properties of iron gall ink, the global market for synthetic pigments. I talked about my world with the same precision and passion that Sebastian used to describe battlefield tactics, or that my father used to describe geopolitical strategy. And for the first time, they listened. They didn't interrupt. They didn't condescend. They just listened, their faces illuminated by the passing headlights, looking like two strangers who had just discovered a secret continent in their own backyard. A few days later, Sebastian came to my studio. It was the first time he had ever visited. He didn't just stand awkwardly in the doorway, as I had expected. He came inside, slowly walking around, his eyes taking in the cluttered workbenches, the rows of pigment vials, the half-restored paintings leaning against the walls. He ran his fingers over a sheet of handmade cotton paper, marveling at the texture. He peered through my magnifying lamp at the intricate web of cracks on an old canvas. He was quiet for a long time. Finally, he turned to me, his expression deeply contemplative. "All these years," he said, his voice quiet. I thought strength was this. He gestured vaguely toward himself, toward the invisible uniform he always seemed to wear. Loud, obvious, physical. But what you did in that courtroom, that was a different kind of strength. It was quiet. It was smarter. It was more precise. You didn't use a weapon. You used the truth. I was the decorated soldier. But you, Lily, you were the real warrior in that room. That moment was the beginning of our real relationship. The old hierarchy of the celebrated son and the overlooked daughter crumbled, and in its place we started to build something new, something based on mutual respect. He started asking me about my projects, and I started to understand the nuances of his work. We found a common language, not in our professions, but in our shared dedication to the details, whether they were in the chemical composition of a pigment or the logistical planning of a mission. The change in my parents was slower, more awkward. Apologies were not in their vocabulary, but their actions began to speak for them. My father started reading books on art history. He would call me with questions about the Renaissance or the chemical composition of ultramarine blue. One day, I came home to find that he had taken down a framed photograph of himself with a famous politician and replaced it with a large, beautifully framed print of my analysis of the forged map's paper fibers, the two microscopic images side by side. He had mounted a small brass plaque beneath it. It read, "Truth in the Details." My mother began to brag about me to her friends, calling me her brilliant forensic artist, a title that wasn't quite accurate but was delivered with such fierce pride that I didn't have the heart to correct her. They were trying. It was a clumsy, imperfect attempt to atone, but it was real. They were learning a new way to see me, and in doing so, a new way to see the world. A world where value wasn't always measured in medals and headlines. It's been 10 years since that day in the courtroom. Sebastian's career recovered, and he eventually rose to the rank of colonel before retiring to teach strategy at the academy. Major Cale was dishonorably discharged and served a long prison sentence for treason and perjury. And me? My life changed in ways I never could have predicted. My work on Sebastian's case brought me a strange, unexpected kind of fame. I opened my own art conservation and authentication consultancy. Museums, auction houses, and private collectors now hire me to find the truth hidden in their art. The military has even put me on a special retainer, consulting with me on authenticating sensitive historical documents. I found my success and my validation not by changing who I was, but by doubling down on it, by embracing the quiet, meticulous, detail-oriented person I had always been. My family's approval came, eventually, but by the time it arrived, I had realized something profound. I no longer needed it. My self-worth wasn't something they could grant or withhold anymore. It was forged in my own studio, in the long hours spent with paper and pigments, in the pursuit of a truth that was silent, molecular, and absolute. The sensitivity and attention to detail they had once called my weaknesses had turned out to be my most formidable strengths. They had looked at me and seen a painter of pretty, useless things, never realizing that my true art was seeing the world as it really was. My journey taught me that your true strength often lies in the very things that people dismiss about you. The world may praise the loud, the bold, and the obvious, but progress, truth, and rescue often come from the quiet corners, from the careful observers, from the people who have mastered the useless skills. Your value isn't determined by the volume of the applause you receive, but by the unique truth you can reveal. So I want to ask you all, have you ever had a skill or a passion that others called useless, only to have it become a superpower later in life? Share your story in the comments below. I would genuinely love to read them. And if this story resonated with you, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories about finding strength in unexpected places. Thank you so much for joining me and for listening to my story. Remember that family is defined by love and respect, not just by blood, and your worth is something you define for yourself.